It's my privilege this morning to moderate our panel on how expungements affect employment. And as I thought about it, this panel could probably more aptly be called How Expungement Affect Life. We are fortunately joined today by four experts on this topic, and I'll start from my far left. Jessica Beheit graduated from Indiana University Moore School of Law in 2019. Jessica is currently completing her Skadden Fellowship in Bloomington, Indiana, working for Indiana Legal Services. Her work focuses on reentry issues, including driver's license suspensions and expungements. To my immediate left, the Honorable Judge Michelle Rick, who presides over family, criminal, and civil cases as Chief Judge Pro Tem of the 29th Circuit Court of Michigan. Judge Rick, in addition to her judicial duties, teaches a class entitled Access to Justice at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law. In 2019, Judge Rick's expungement clinic combined her experience as a judge and law professor to create Project Access, a traveling expungement clinic, which in the summer of 2019 brought civil justice relief to more than 100 people in 6 rural counties in Michigan. Earlier this year, the Michigan Supreme Court, again showing its insight, recognized Judge Rick as, quote, a judge who gives back. To my immediate right, Tish Lee is the managing attorney of the Washtenaw County Direct Services Office of Michigan Advocacy Program, one of our hosts here this weekend, where Tish has practiced for more than 20 years, primarily in the areas of elder housing benefits and consumer law. Prior to joining MAP, Tish was public benefits support attorney with the Massachusetts Law Reform Institute in Boston. To my far right, Herb Fluker is currently a career advisor at Michigan Works Southeast and is responsible for case management of federally funded programs such as food assistance employment training and TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. Herb also works as a reentry advisor coach and mentor for those seeking new employment career opportunities. Prior to joining Michigan Works Southeast, Herb was a sergeant for Michigan State Police and served in the U.S. Army. A few words of background before we get to our panel. We in the U.S. incarcerate 716 people for every 100,000 residents, more than any other country. The U.S. in 2015 had almost 2.2 million prisoners in adult facilities. That means we held 21% of the world's prisoners, even while the U.S. only had about 4.4% of the world's population. The effects of incarceration create enormous barriers long after release from incarceration. For example, a 2015 study showed that compared to those with no criminal record, individuals with a 1-year-old conviction were 66% less likely to be offered a job interview. And this condition has a long, maybe everlasting shelf life, where even those with a 10-year-old convictions were 33% less likely to get a job interview. These types of barriers magnify the importance and need for expungement, and just so we're all on the same page, expungement is the legal process for sealing or erasing criminal records. These needs are particularly acute in the low-income populations that our legal aid programs represented on this panel and in this room and across the country work with. In 2018, LSC-funded legal aid programs closed over 18,000 expungement cases. And these are not just numbers, these are thousands and thousands of lives whose opportunities were increased as a result of these representations. So let's get to our panel. And let's start, Judge Rick and Jessica, with some legal framework for our discussion. Judge Rick, can you tell us who's eligible for expungement in Michigan, and have there been changes in those arrangements?
The people who are currently eligible for an expungement in Michigan are first-time felons, so long as they do not have more than 2 misdemeanor convictions in addition to that 1 felony. They are eligible to have their felony expunged. Those with no felony record, as long as they have no more than 2 misdemeanors, are eligible. There are carve-outs, of course. Traffic offenses are not subject to expungement, nor are sex offenses, life or attempt life offenses, or human trafficking offenses. There was a study published in March of this year by 2 professors here at the University of Michigan, J.J. Prescott and Sonia Starr. Their work is entitled Expungement of Criminal Convictions, an Empirical Study. They had access to data from the state of Michigan and from the state police. And while we do not know specifically the percentage of people eligible for expungements through their work, we know that approximately 300,000 convictions are added annually to court dockets, and only approximately 2,000 expungements on an annual basis are granted.
Jessica, can you talk about Indiana? Who's eligible for expungement under Indiana law?
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me here. So Indiana's expungement law is actually quite liberal and progressive, which is absolutely fantastic for all of our clients. Pretty much everyone is eligible for an expungement unless you have murdered someone or you are a sex offender. We have waiting period requirements, so it doesn't matter how many misdemeanors you've had, how many felonies you've had. It mostly just depends on the type of crime that you've committed, so no sex offenders, not if you've committed murder or attempted murder or anything with a dangerous weapon. But everything else is capable of being expunged. You just have to wait a certain amount of time. For misdemeanors, it's 5 years. For low-level felonies, it's 8 years. And then for anything higher than that, you need to wait 8 to 10 years, and then sometimes need to get special permission from the prosecutor and written consent. Even with those waiting periods in mind, prosecutors have the discretion to waive the waiting periods. And in my experience working in our 14-county area in south central Indiana, prosecutors are quite willing to waive those waiting period requirements and let people get early expungements. So some people are getting expungements 2-3 years after getting their misdemeanor conviction, and they're moving on from their life shortly thereafter, which is fantastic. Indiana also allows people to expunge non-conviction records. So anytime you've been arrested and were charged with a crime but were never actually convicted, you can have that expunged and sealed as many times as you like in your entire life. The downside to Indiana's expungement law is that for any time that you'd like to get a conviction record expunged, you can only file 1 petition in your entire lifetime. So that means that if you got a misdemeanor 5 years ago, for example, you became eligible, you got that expunged, and tomorrow you went out and were convicted of a new crime, that crime would be on your record for the rest of your life.
If I could just follow up briefly, because that reminds me, in Michigan, our law requires that an individual wait 5 years from the latest of either date of sentence, discharge from probation, or discharge from parole. While our law is not nearly as expansive as Indiana's, I should also mention that right now, pending in both the House and in the Senate, there are sweeping changes that are bipartisan being offered in hopes of expanding not only the types of crimes that may be expunged, but also contemplating automatic expungements for certain offenses and offering different timetables. There are a number of proposals on the table, so I don't want to get too much into the specifics of that, but We are very hopeful that there will be expansions that will open the doors, so we see more than the 6.5 people in Michigan, 6.5% of people in Michigan eligible for an expungement actually obtaining an expungement.
I think what Judge Rick has just described and what Chief Justice McCormick described this morning as reform in these areas of reentry generally, and in this instance expungement, are hopeful. This is not a time for cooperation and bipartisanship generally across the country, but in this area on reentry, there is cooperation, there is bipartisanship, so hopefully we can continue that progress. I'd like to move now to the process in both Michigan and Indiana for expungement. So Tish, do you want to start off by walking us through the process of securing an expungement for a client in Michigan?
Yes, thanks, Ron, and thank you, everyone, for allowing me to be here. We have a very exciting expungement initiative here in Washtenaw County that we'll talk about a little bit later, but I wanted to talk to you now about the process that a person needs to go through to obtain an expungement in Michigan. To you lawyers out there, it will probably seem pretty familiar, pretty straightforward, but I really want to emphasize here that for a layperson, for someone who's not familiar with court procedures, the process can seem very complex and very intimidating. And I have to hark back to the quote from Coach Harbaugh. It's like, if you're a layperson without a lawyer trying to go through this process, it's a lot like being on the field without a helmet and pads. It can be mystifying. It can be, you can get caught up in a lot of technical requirements that laypersons are not familiar with. But in addition to that, there are expenses, there are fees that go along with pretty much every stage of the process. And that's yet another barrier for the low-income folks that we want to serve in our expungement work. We'll talk in a minute about something positive that we were able to get together in Washtenaw. But this is the process. So first of all, you have to find out what's on your criminal record. And so for a lot of these folks, these things happened years and years ago, and they're not quite sure. And so one of the most reliable ways, but not entirely reliable, is to go onto an internet database that the state of Michigan maintains. It's called the Internet Criminal History Access Tool. It's abbreviated ICHAT, so I'll try not to use that too much, but it is an internet tool for looking up your Michigan criminal history. And that, if you go online, it's $10 per search, so that's your first fee. You look at your record. Sometimes there are mistakes on the iChat. Sometimes there are mistakes on the record. So that can be a barrier. But if you find, according to the very restrictive criteria that Michigan has now, that you are eligible for an expungement, then your next step is to get fingerprinted. And so that costs you some more money, usually. You can go to our county sheriff's office. It costs you $15 to get your fingerprints done. Then you have to get a certified copy of your criminal record from the court that issued it. That costs $10 plus $1 per page. And then you get to the application. There's a standard application that you fill out. It has to be notarized, and so you take that, you fill out that application, you get it notarized, you make 5 copies of that and your record of conviction, and then you file that with the court. And different courts have different procedures for filing, so you have to figure out what that is.
Just a quick question. So say I've had charges, 3 different charges on 3 different occasions in, say, 2 different courts. Do I just do what you just described once, or do I need to do it 3 times?
You need to do it 3 times for each conviction. And so it's often multiple courts as well. Okay, so once you've gotten your application filed and stamped, you get some copies of it back, you have to serve three parties. You have to serve the prosecutor, in your case, for the jurisdiction, in your case. You have to serve the Attorney General, and you have to serve the Michigan State Police. The Michigan State Police gets the original application, and they also have to get the fingerprint card and another $50. So the state police process that application. They generate your complete criminal history, and then they send that to the court. Once all of your documents have been served on those parties, then you have to fill out the proof of service for the application, and you file that with the court. And then eventually, hopefully, not too far in the future, you get a hearing date. And so you need to prepare for your hearing. Essentially, you need to be ready to demonstrate to the court how you've turned your life around since the conviction. You can gather documents, you can bring in witnesses if you like, and essentially just prepare yourself for that hearing. If you're lucky enough to have an attorney, the attorney can write a brief for you. And we've done that in several of our expungement cases. But the brief will lay out the standards for expungement and essentially help you make your case that you have turned your life around, you've had no involvement with the criminal justice system in the meantime, and that there are compelling reasons for the expungement to be granted. And then you have your hearing. Hopefully, the judge grants it and signs your order, and then the last and final step is you have to go back and make sure that the online record is corrected, because it isn't always corrected in a timely way. So you need to follow up on that. But essentially, that's it.
Well, that's easy. Jessica, how do things work in Indiana? How do they differ, if at all?
I'm very grateful after hearing your process. So I'll just take you through what would happen after someone applies to our office to see. So firstly, obviously, they have to be eligible for our services. And then the first thing we do is a quick online search of their criminal record. We don't have a fantastic online database. It's haphazard at best if courts have actually sent the information to what's called My Case, which is an online service, and not every county in Indiana uses the same websites. We have two different websites we have to check. And even then, usually the most consistent information is from 2013 and onwards, and the majority of our clients have criminal convictions that are much earlier than that. You can imagine 2014 misdemeanor convictions are just now eligible for expungements if you're waiting the 5-year period. So we do a quick online search to make sure they don't have any pending criminal charges. You cannot file an expungement in Indiana if you have a pending criminal charge, which makes sense. And then we dig a little deeper. So if they have any recent convictions under the 5-year time period, I'll look and see if I think that the prosecutor in that particular county, if I have a good working relationship with them, I might just call them up really quick and see if they might be willing to waive the waiting period requirement. Otherwise, if I don't see anything online, that's when everything gets complicated. So at that point, I would ask our client to go get fingerprinting done. And the fingerprinting is done through an independent service. They pay $22 to get their criminal record, and it's supposed to be a federal background check. It's the best thing that they can get, but it's never been complete. I have not ever seen a fingerprinting report that has my client's entire criminal history on it. So that's one piece of the puzzle, plus the online search that I've already done, plus any information that my client might remember. So one client in particular I've been helping this week remembered having 6 felony convictions from the 80s. Doesn't remember what they were, when they were, and only thing he remembers is what county it was in. So my next step is calling the records department. So I have to help my clients through this process because most of the court staff aren't accessible to individual people. So they don't know to call the records department. The records department would be, and has complained to me before about how frustrating it is helping individual people on the phone they prefer that they deal with an attorney, emailing back and forth. It's not quite accessible to our clients, so I try and step in as much as I can and get those records for them. So hopefully at that point, they have the record. Sometimes they don't. So sometimes that's the best that I can do. So I've got fingerprinting online and sometimes records from the records department. That's hopefully their criminal history. Then I have to make sure that they've paid all of their fines. Indiana requires that every court cost, fine, and fee associated with a criminal case that you're asking to be expunged be paid. That is probably the largest barrier to getting expungements for our clients. I think last week I had to break the news to someone that they owe $1,800 in criminal court costs. You can imagine, I can't afford that, so I can't imagine any of my clients coming up with almost $2,000 to pay off a court costs, especially since the reason that they don't have a job is because of this criminal record. So they don't have a job because of the criminal record, but they can't get the criminal record off of the criminal conviction off of their record without coming up with $2,000. If nothing is owing, and I have their complete record, then we look and see what type of expungement they qualify for. In Indiana, there are non-discretionary expungements, which is fantastic, which means that as long as we help them fill out the paperwork correctly, the judge does not have a choice in the matter and has to grant the expungement. And they don't have to have a hearing. So oftentimes we help them fill out the correct paperwork, we help them file it with the court, and the judge grants the expungement, never has to have a hearing, and they didn't really have a choice in the matter because as long as the record meets the requirements, it's granted. It's less likely that we have situations where our clients need to have a hearing. Those are the situations with where bodily harm was involved in one of their criminal convictions, and that just is not very likely for us. More often what we see is upper level felonies with drug convictions where we need to have a hearing. After that, after it's been granted, then we have a long distribution list. It gets sent to a bunch of different agencies and we have to make sure that they're actually getting rid of those records as well.
Well, it's two clear takeaways from both these presentations. One, hard to imagine that anybody could do these processes without a lawyer. And two, even if you had a pro bono lawyer, that pro bono lawyer who is not a full-time or experienced expungement lawyer would require a fair bit of training to master these processes that Tish and Jessica just described. Herb, before joining Michigan Works, you were a Michigan State Police officer for 23 years. Now you run an expungement fair that serves as a one-stop shop for individuals seeking expungement. How did you get from there to here?
Well, Ron, it's been a very interesting journey. First and foremost, I was in one of those silos that the Chief of Justice spoke of. I was in law enforcement, and being in law enforcement, I had a particular, view of when crimes were committed, that I was there to make sure that the laws were enforced and that the proper people were brought into the criminal justice system. It's funny, it's today. I'm indeed honored to be here today in front of a bunch of esteemed lawyers and judges. Usually when I sat before people in your profession, I was always on the stand in court, so it's just a little different. But once I left that silo and came into Michigan Works is concerned with workforce development. We are there to assist people in the state who are looking for new careers or change of career to achieve that goal. Also, we're in the business of helping businesses to expand their employment base, to retain their workers. One thing that who my service center manager, Johnny Epps, is here today, and I'm glad he could come along with my deputy director, Shamar Heron. One thing that we were faced with were we would get individuals employment opportunities, but then they couldn't get the job because they had something on their criminal background. And we would talk to employers, and The service center manager, Johnny, came to me and said, Herb, you know, I know you've been in law enforcement. Is there something we can do? I knew a little bit about expungement, so we decided to try to embark upon having an expungement committee. We both agreed that we couldn't do it alone. Michigan Works, we know a lot about employment. However, we don't know everything, when it comes to the law, so we had to go out and recruit partners. Now, we have some very good partners. We approached the Washtenaw County Prosecutor's Office. We approached the Washtenaw County Public Defenders, the Sheriff's Department, and all of those individuals, to my surprise, were like, yes, we're willing to help and we're going to help. We had Michigan Legal Help come in, and when Michigan Legal Help came in, that's how I was introduced to this wonderful individual sitting next to me, Tish. Tish came in and said, yep, Legal Service Corporation, and we're interested, we're already doing some things, and we're willing to help. I'm happy to say that this is our third year where we've had a one-stop expungement fair here in Washtenaw County. The first year that we started it, we had 25 individuals show up to the fair, and when they came to the fair, 18 of those individuals now have an expungement. So, of course, after the first year, we were excited. But I know Johnny over here always says, hey, we can do better. We got to do better. We want more. So our goal was to expand it. So the second year, we were able to expand the program. More partners came on board. The Department of Health and Human Services decided that they would lend their expertise. And as we sat at committee meetings, everybody came up with various ideas. I was happy when people said, because one of the things that Jessica was talking about was cost, and Tish was talking about cost. I was thinking like, okay, we can't afford all of these experts on this expungement committee. But luckily, everybody was saying, hey, no cost, we're going to do this. The Sheriff's Department came in and said, we'll fingerprint everybody that comes to the expungement fair for free. So it was something that just took off. Now, the third year, we just had our third annual expungement fair this past September 14th. Washtenaw Literacy, Dave over here, is also a valued member. They help us get the word out. We developed what we call pre-screening prior to the actual fair. So at the pre-screenings, we were able to bring individuals in who we were already seeing and then reach out to the community and to the county by advertisement, and more people came. This year, we were lucky enough that another partner, United Way of Washtenaw County, decided that we were eligible for a grant. That grant allowed us to reach out to individuals and tell them that if you were eligible for expungement, we would be there from day one all the way through court, and all of the fees are paid for. The Public Defender's Office and Legal Services Corporation, Public Defender is sitting in our midst, Delphia Simpson. They're wonderful at digging into those parts of the criminal history record that may be confusing. They've solved complicated things. One case we dealt with was a case where there showed 2 felonies on the iChatter criminal history record, but it was actually only one. It was a person was given the first felony, and then they were given conditions where if they fulfilled the conditions, the felony would be removed, but they didn't fulfill the conditions. They forgot about it. So now they went back to court, and now there were 2 felonies on the record because the Michigan State Police, who are the holders of the criminal history records, thought that 2 different processes had taken place. So it took both, Tish and Delphia to go look, get everything, and then that person was eligible for an expungement. So it's been a very interesting project, and it aligns with one of the things that we have at Michigan Works Southeast, our purpose statement, creating connections for a brighter future. Those connections that we've made with everyone on our executive or expungement committee is every day working toward creating a brighter future for those individuals who have already paid their penance to society and now are trying to get a new, fresh start.
Okay, that's great. Tish, could you briefly tell us about Legal Services of South Central Michigan's expungement work and why you started to do more of it?
Well, yeah, I think Herb just gave a great narrative of how we became involved in this project. It was really the brainchild, I think, of the great team at Michigan Works, including Johnny and Herb and all their staff, and they were able to bring in our essential partners, really, the public defender, the prosecutor, and the sheriff's office. And we also had a great deal of help from the website, the Michigan Legal Help website, because they actually have a self-help tool on their website to try to help folks navigate the expungement process on their own. And so we were brought in through them and developed this program and helped get the grant from United Way to make this past expungement fair extremely successful. The grant covered not only fees for indigent folks who are trying to get expungements, but also some of the advertising costs for the fair. So we were able to reach out with actually some pretty effective digital advertising to reach a lot more people than we had in the past. But we do a lot of, well, we've done a few expungements, I'd say. I was looking at our records, maybe a couple dozen in the last couple of years. And what we have noticed, actually, is these cases turn out often to be advice-only cases because the large majority of them are not eligible. And so what happens is these are folks who come to us and say, you know, am I eligible for an expungement? And because the law is so restrictive now, we have to give them the sad news that, no, we can't do an expungement for you. I think the numbers I'm seeing are that roughly maybe a third of the folks who have come through are eligible. And in those cases where we've assisted folks, we do have a 100% success rate. So I guess the question is, why do we do this work? Why is it so important? And I'll tell you, like Herb says, it's about giving brighter futures to folks who have paid their debt and have demonstrated in many ways that they have moved on and they are looking for greater opportunities for themselves and their families. So, you know, the criminal record is a bar to all sorts of opportunities, and a lot of them are related to employment, to being able to give a better life to your family, and also just contributing to the economy. For instance, there might be an entrepreneur who wants to start a small business, but because of an old criminal record, might not be able to get a loan or might not be able to get a professional license, and those doors are closed to them until they can get an expungement. Or, for instance, we see a lot of clients who are trying to start careers in healthcare, in social work, in technology. Some of those career opportunities are closed to them because of their past criminal records. These are actually all real examples of folks that we've helped, and once their records were cleared, they were able to take advantage of opportunities that weren't available to them before. And I also wanted to mention, particularly, there's also an effect of past criminal history on housing opportunities. I know the last panel talked about housing and how important that was, and the way a landlord-tenant record can be a bar to housing. Well, a criminal record can also be a bar to housing. There are some landlords who will not rent, they will check your criminal history, and no matter how old it is, they will refuse to rent to you. And as we know, housing stability is often a prerequisite to financial stability.
I think we have a pretty good picture about how hard it is to apply for expungement and how important it is. Judge Rick, you've started a program that's addressing those difficult-to-meet needs, a program where you and clinic staff from Detroit Mercy Law School take students into rural areas in Michigan. And can you tell us about that program and the number of people you've been able to serve?
Yes, happy to. First of all, I'm really grateful that two of our students who were part of that traveling expungement clinic are here today, Catherine Gannick and Courtney Wood, as well as Professor Associate Dean of Experiential Education, Nick Schreck, and Rebecca Simpkins-Nowak, who is the Director of Clinical Operations and Outreach at Detroit Mercy. Detroit Mercy has been operating clinical programs since 1965 and is one of the oldest in the country in terms of offering those experiential opportunities to serve the poor and those who are otherwise marginalized and voiceless. And several years ago, I returned to my alma mater and asked if I could teach a class, which is entitled Access to Justice. And in that class, we explore both the criminal and the civil justice gap. And one of the mandatory readings is the 2017 LSC Justice Gap Report, which enlightens students as to those segments of society who are left behind. In addition to mandatory readings, I have a number of speakers who come in and talk about the justice gap from their perspective. And after a few years of hearing from people like Angela Tripp from Michigan Legal Help and Jennifer Bentley from the Michigan State Bar Foundation and Ashley Lowe from Lakeshore Legal Aid, I had somewhat of an epiphany, and I thought, I wonder if the law school could make an application to the State Bar Foundation and, working through courts, since I'm a sitting judge, offer some expungement clinics in rural communities. And we're very grateful to the State Bar Foundation for affording us a $20,000 grant, which we utilized this summer. Initially, we were intending to visit 8 communities. We visited 6, all in lower northern Michigan. And while we were on the road, we were receiving calls from communities asking, will you come? And one of the inquiries was made by Chief Justice Bridget McCormick, who said, will you please come to the Hall of Justice and conduct a clinic, which we did conduct earlier this week. But the essence of the program was when a judge calls, people respond. And so I called stakeholders like our local sheriffs, our county clerks, did outreach with others in the community. For their part, the law school pre-registered people. We advertised ahead of time, sending flyers out to the communities we were serving. And through that pre-registration process, we're able to pre-screen out people who might not be eligible, either due to the number of convictions they had or the lack of time that had passed, et cetera. When people were pre-registered and came to the clinic, our local law enforcement donated their services to print people for free. Our clerks donated certified copies of convictions. We utilized our funding in part to cover the cost of the internet search for the criminal backgrounds, as we were unable to secure that free of charge. And again, we are very grateful we had those resources. And within the confines of a courtroom, people came to court willingly, wanting assistance. And we saw over the summer, the 6th county clinic, we were able to assist approximately 50% of the 111 people who came through. And we, like what happens in Washtenaw County, intended a one-stop shop where we would get individuals as far as we could. And along those lines, those various notices and copies of applications that had to go out to the various entities, we utilized our funding not only to provide the paperwork so that we could make the copies, but we also had envelopes and stamps And people knew when they walked out the door that they just had to show up for their hearing. The judges in the community were involved as well. When we were in communities where, for example, I was not the judge, I was the last station where I could talk with people and debrief about what to expect when you next go back to your judge for your hearing. And we reinforced the need to have letters of recommendation or, put together your story for your judge about the hardship that you faced or the successes that you've had since the time that you offended.
I'd like to thank our panel for being here today and for being on the front line